In this video, let's unpack and solve the mystery of how to create a successful exposure blend for architectural and real estate photography. Being able to bring back those overexposed highlights outside of the window into a believable image is an essential skill for an architectural photographer. One of the things that people struggle with the most is that the image gets a little muddy and loses contrast, and it's that exact thing that I'm going to show you how to overcome today. Here we are inside of Photoshop, and let's start with a finish because I want to show you what we're actually aiming for. So this is the original raw file, just with some geometric corrections, and this is kind of what we're aiming for as a finished result, and it's very achievable with the system I'm going to show you. I'm just going to hide the finishing retouching, and we'll just concentrate on the two additions that I add to this base layer here. The first is one to actually add in detail to the shadows. So here's our before and here's our after with a little pop to the shadows. And here are the highlights brought back as well. So before and after. And it's very simple. If I hold down the Alt key on Windows or Option on the Mac and click on the mask, you can see how rough and ready the masks are that I actually created to bring back these details. So it's very, very simple to do. The more complex version of the masking, which looks like this for the highlights, and this for the shadows, that has all been created for me using Lumenzia, which I'll show you. I know a lot of you have that panel already, but you're still struggling. So let's jump over to Lightroom and figure this out once and for all. You can see that I have a set of 7 images that make up my bracketed set, starting with a base exposure. Then I have an image which is 3 stops darker, 2 stops darker, 1 stop darker, and then we go into the brighter set, which is 1 stop over, 2 stops over, and 3 stops over what the camera thought was the best base exposure. These are all shot on a tripod. I also have one additional image where I turned on the lights as well, so that I have that option to include this information if I want to in the final composite. However, we're going to keep things nice and simple and just look at how we can brighten up the area of the kitchen here, which is too dark, and potentially other shadow areas as well, and also control the information in the highlights outside here as well, particularly in the sky, but also in the garden as well. So let's jump into the develop module. I'm going to select all 8 photos and I'm in auto sync mode so that any changes I make to one photo will be applied to all of them. I'm going to switch over to a camera neutral profile, so our colors are more accurate and we have a less contrasty dynamic range as well. Now, although I've shot 7 different exposures in this particular example, that is usually overkill. Often you'll only need a set of 5, but I like to cover myself when I'm on site. I don't want to come back and realize that the darkest exposure I've got still doesn't have the detail I need in the highlights. So I'd rather overshoot when I'm on site and discard those photos when I get home, than get home and realize I don't have all the information that I need. So the next thing we want to do is select 3 photos, one to represent the highlight details, one to represent the midtones, and then one that we're going to use to bring back the shadow information. And which photos you choose is going to be quite important. So this is our base exposure here, or at least what the camera thought was the best exposure. However, all I'm concerned about at the moment is the sort of mid-tone in the photo. And if we look at the histogram, it's only very slight, but it is shifting over towards the left more predominantly. I would prefer a cleaner image working to the right of the histogram. Now, yeah, we're overexposing more elements, but I'm not worried about that. I just want the interior of the property looking as good as it can. And I would sooner drop down the exposure of a slightly overexposed photo, like half a stop, rather than coming into that base exposure, going, that's too dark, and having to boost that up. So we're going to work on this as our base image, and I'm just going to press P on the keyboard to pick it. We're just going to go 1 stop brighter to deal with the shadow areas. If I zoom in here, I think that's adequate for actually brightening that area up. So I'm going to press P on the keyboard to pick that one. And now we need to select an image for our highlights. So you might think that this darkest exposure would be the best option because by far the details in the sky all look very good there. However, what I want to do is pick an image where I can recover those highlights and they still look good, but I want to actually be able to bring up these shadows on the interior of the property as well. I'm not actually going to do that yet because what I want to do is do minimal editing inside of Lightroom so I can demonstrate where you may be going wrong with this method. So the next step is we're going to open these in Photoshop, and there's a few different ways we can do that. If we come to Edit in and Edit in Photoshop, these are all going to be opened as 3 separate files. However, Another option we have is to open as layers in Photoshop. However, the problem with that is when we want to make adjustments inside Photoshop to those layers, we no longer have access to the raw data. So we want to open them with access to all of the sliders we have inside of Lightroom, still be able to access that in in Photoshop. And the way to do that is to open them as smart objects. So you're going to have so much more flexibility doing it this way. So we come to Edit in, and here we want to choose Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. And now we have those 3 photo files opened as individual photos in Photoshop. So I'm just going to add them all into one document. And I'm going to do that by pressing the V key and then clicking and dragging them into the base layer. And I'm going to hold the Shift key when I let go so we keep an identical position, and it overlays them directly over the top. And now I can dock that again, and we have our 3 layers to work on. So now I think it'll be valuable to show you how this can go wrong, why it's going wrong, and then we can correct it from there. So what I'll show you now is the correct method for creating our masks. It's just the preparation of the files that is going to let us down. So the first thing we're going to do is actually bring back the shadow detail. So what I want to do is jump into Lumenzia here, and I'm going to click the D option, and that is going to make a selection based on our darkest pixels. We can make a refinement based on coming down, clicking these successive D numbers, and the higher the number goes, the tighter that mask around the blacks and darker pixels is going to get. But I like to keep things nice and broad. Usually just the main big D key is a good option, and then all we do is click mask with the shadow layer selected, and now when I click the eyeball tool, we can see that we're revealing detail in the shadows. Basically, where this mask is white, we're revealing what is on this layer, which is brighter pixels, and so that is exactly what we're seeing in the shadows. But already you can see that we're starting to lose contrast, and we're kind of muddying up this file. But stay with me, we're going to fix it. Now we're going to select the highlights layer here, again making sure it's not visible currently while we're making our mask, and we're going to come up to Lumenzia again. This time we're going to press the L key because that's going to select our lights. We've got the D for the darks, L for the lights, M selects the midtones. Now this is a very broad selection with the L, and I normally like to come down somewhere around L2 is pretty good. However, if you want to refine your mask, you can actually grab this little slider on the right hand side, and that is actually going to tighten up or loosen up the mask depending where you want to put it. But what I'm looking for is a pure white in the areas that I definitely want to bring back, and then a gradiated transition through these grey tones. And once we're happy with this selection, all we need to do again is just click that mask button. And now I'm going to come down to the eyeball tool and let's reveal it. Oh my God, doesn't that look great? Absolutely not. And I'm pretty sure that it's this kind of image that you guys that are reaching out to me saying you're having problems and you're frustrated because your images are looking very flat and washed out, no contrast. This is where you're going wrong. You're probably doing something like this, expecting to get those same results that I've been showing in my other videos and feeling let down with the process. So we're going to fix this. But firstly, I've got to say that 𝗥𝗲𝗰𝗀𝗀𝗀 who actually makes Lumenzia, the panel, has put together some excellent video instructions on how to get the most out of the panel, and I strongly recommend that if you're going to invest in the panel, you might as well get his mastery blending course. I'll put a link to it in the description below, but it explains exactly how to get the most out of the panel, because if you're an architectural or real estate photographer and you do this for a living day in, day out, you need this tool. Like, honestly, it's a game changer, but you've got to understand how to use it. But for those of you who already own the panel, this is how we fix it. Okay, we need a two-pronged attack to deal with this. The first is actually masking itself, and the second is setting up our files correctly. First of all, let's work on the mask. So this is our layer that's actually reintroducing detail into the shadows. We're brightening up those shadows, but we're also brightening up some of the midtones as well, based on this mask here. So as you know, white reveals, black conceals, and anything that's grey in between is also going to reveal pixels, but not with the same level of intensity. The brighter it is, the more of the layer that mask is applied to, we're going to see. So this is where we're at the moment, but I don't want to apply this across the whole image, because If we look at our base layer, it's not everywhere in the image where we've lost information in those dark shadows. It's predominantly over here on the left hand side in this little darker pocket of the kitchen here, perhaps a little bit around the TV over in this corner, but other than that we don't really need to see any of this layer anywhere else, and that's where double masking comes in. And so to add another mask to the mask that already exists, what I'm going to do is create a group, drop this layer into the group, and now I can actually put a mask onto this group. Currently we see everything because the mask is white, so what we need to do is invert that. So Control I is going to turn that black, and now currently we don't see any of this shadow recovery, so it's up to us just to come in with a nice big paintbrush and actually just reveal that where we want it. I'm currently at 50% opacity. That's fine. I'm just going to click and start painting, and now anywhere where I paint, we're just brightening up those shadows only. I'll put a little pop of that down the back there. That might be a little bit too bright, so I'm just going to drop the opacity, press X on my keyboard to get to a black paintbrush, and just remove it a little bit. You know, that's fine. Let's just look at our before and our after. Before and after, a big improvement. And we can do the same with the highlights as well. So if we look at what that's introducing into the image, we're getting very washed out. And that is because we also have bright pixels right through here where we've got white on the ceiling, on the floor. There's white all over the place. And so the mask that we created here, it's going to be revealing that highlight recovery right throughout the photo. And we don't want that. That's why we're getting the muddying effect. We only really want it out of the window here. And so I'm going to create another group where we can reveal this. Now you'd be forgiven for thinking, well, why can't I just come in and start working on this mask individually and just with a black paintbrush, maybe with 100%, just start getting rid of all of this over here. And then that way I'm only going to see my highlights brought back in over there. But that's a really unrefined way to do it, because if you decide you would then want to bring back a little bit of that information and we switch to white, we go to 50% opacity and I start painting that back, I've not got all of that detailed information that the 𝗨𝗀𝗰𝗺𝗃 mask created for me. First of all, now all I have is my big fat paintbrush, and that's just no good. So let's just jump into the history. So I'll undo that and we'll just come back and do this the correct way. So that is to create a new group that we're going to drop that layer into, and now we can mask this group. So I'm going to click the icon to add a mask. I'm going to invert the mask, and now I can just paint that in only where I want it. So I'm currently at 50% opacity. So let's do that. Let's just start to build this effect up by painting it in. We can be pretty rough and ready, a little bit over the tiles there. I'm going to drop the opacity down somewhere around 18, paint a little bit over there. You know, we're just normalizing out the exposure by painting this effect back in. However, there's a problem. Here is our before, here is our after. Not only are we revealing information outside, but we're also muddying down this column here. We're muddying down this area of the room as well. This is not what we're after. So what is the solution? Well, this is where it comes down to setting up our layers properly. And you've got to understand the concept here to actually make this work. We have our base layer, and we're trying to plug in the gaps of those highlights and those shadows seamlessly into that base layer. Currently, what we're plugging in is muddying it up, and that is because we have a transition between the highlights into the midtones. And when we hit the midtones, those midtones in our highlights layer are much darker than we want them to be. Ideally, so we don't see that transition zone, the midtone in that highlights layer, controlling those highlights, that should match the midtones as closely as possible in the base layer. Hopefully you've got that. You may need to re-listen to it. Let me explain it with the shadows. So we are trying to reintroduce shadow information, a brightening of those shadows. We've created a mask that allows those shadows to be brought into the main base layer. The muddying effect that we are seeing is coming in the midtones. Again, we want the midtones of the shadow recovery layer to match the midtones in the base layer. If we do that, we're not going to experience that muddying look. So let's open up those raw sliders that we can do for each layer, because they're still smart objects. I'm going to make some adjustments and you'll see how much better and more seamlessly these now will blend in, thus creating our exposure blended image. Let's take a look. Let's hide the highlight layer and just look at the shadows. Now currently, to be honest, it's not too much of a problem. The actual blending in of this shadow area is pretty good, so I might not worry about that too much. But the highlights we definitely want to take care of, because that is definitely darkening down the interior of the house too much. That is not a good look. We just want to take care of the exterior. Also, the exterior is just getting a little bit flat looking as well. So what can we do about that? Well, we need to double click on the icon here representing the layer, and that's going to open up our raw controls and allow me to actually have a play around and adjust these. And just so you know, I would normally have done all of this inside of Lightroom before these were brought into Photoshop. This is purely for demonstration purposes, and all of the changes that I make, I would normally have a preset to take care of the highlights layer, one for the shadows layer, one for the base layer. And so it's a very quick and simple process usually. This is only long because I'm explaining it all. One of the things I like to do is grab the exposure slider and bring it all the way up and just check that I have recoverable information through the midtones, which I definitely do. So from here, let's see what we can build. What I'd like to do is bring the highlights down, because this is definitely the area we're wanting to recover. But currently you can see already it is going a bit muddy. So you think we don't want to go that far with it, but maybe we do. By bringing the highlight slider down all the way, we can actually now bring the exposure slider much further up and bring back that information in the midtones, which will much more closely match the midtones in the base layer, but with the added advantage of now having all of that information outside. If you feel things are still getting a little washed out, you can play with the contrast slider, give that a little pop if you want to. We can make sure that we are hitting pure white up here by clicking the triangle in the top right corner there. There are currently no warnings, so we haven't maximized our white point. So we'll bring that up, plus 34, starting to see a little peak of white there. That's good. And I'm thinking by adding the contrast, we've probably taken those blacks a little bit too far. So I'll reset that. We can add perhaps a little bit of clarity, but the main thing we want to be aware of is making sure that this interior area around here that went very muddy before is not going that way anymore. And another thing that we can do to take care of that is just come into the curve here, grab our little sampler tool here and just bring that over this interior bit here. And as I do that, you can see a little circle appear on the line of the curve, and that's indicating exactly where we need to brighten up if we want to bring up detail there. So I can just click and start taking that to the right, and that is going to brighten that area as well. So let's click OK and just look at that pop. See all that muddiness just disappear? We've solved that issue. So all of a sudden, we've now brought back that information in the highlight, but we've not muddied the interior. And that is it. That is the key that a lot of you have been asking me about. How do you create a successful exposure blend? That's it. Just make sure that the midtones match between the three different layers, and you'll be golden. Once you've got those extreme highlights and shadows taken care of, and you have a more harmonious dynamic range throughout your image, you can then merge those layers down and you can go to town with your retouching, your finishing touches, all of that good stuff that will just elevate your work to the next level. But this is the foundation that you need so that you can take care of those highlights in the first place. So this is the disgusting muddy version that a lot of you have been getting and complaining about, and this is how you do it properly. So from this to this, and the two things that you need to remember to make sure you get a successful exposure blend with your architectural photography is double masking, so you only mask that recovery effect of the shadows or the highlights only where you want it in the image, not through the whole thing. And the second thing is to set the layers up properly so that the midtones of the highlight recovery or shadow recovery layer don't interfere with the midtones of the base layer. And you do that by making sure that they either match or are slightly brighter than the midtones in the base layer. If this free training video has been helpful to you, do me a favor, give me a thumbs up, even leave me a comment letting me know what you thought of it below. But if you're interested in architectural and real estate photography, editing in particular, my complete workflow is covered in that video right there. So I think you'll enjoy that one. Head there, I'll see you there. And if you haven't subscribed already, you can click that button and I'll see you in all my future videos. Cheers, guys. See you next. See you, blah, blah, blah.